for Putin, who controls the media, he controls the messaging inside Russia. How on earth do you control the messaging when you've actually ended up vacating one region? We understand now that it's also Belgorod and Bryansk oblasts have also been evacuated. Imagine the message that sends to the people of Russia. It's all starting to unravel. And I think that's a very powerful message. And also, if it means that how does Russia square this circle of protecting its own border whilst also pushing hard on the front line?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and the incursion into Russia. And I'm delighted to be joined by Sean Bell, former fighter pilot, respected military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast. Sean, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good, James. Good afternoon. Lovely to see you.
I mean, where to begin with the events of the past week? It is almost a week now since Ukraine launched its incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. It's pretty much the first significant invasion of Russian territory on this scale since the Second World War. What is your analysis of it?
Yeah, it is fascinating, James. I think when we first heard about it on Tuesday last week, I read a lot of critics of it who basically said, what the hell is Ukraine doing? They are the David to the Russian Goliath. They are heading into Russian territory where they will be snuffed out. Operation Certain Death. Why are they wasting valuable resources? I have to say, the more you look into it, though, particularly as the Ukrainians have expanded that salient, I think this could end up being a really, really smart move. The challenge will be how it ends, because it will inevitably end. Russia will be very embarrassed by what's going on. But if reports are to be believed that they've got up to 30 kilometers into Russia, it does sound like the initial push was about 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers, about 20 tanks, including some Western battle tanks. So they do seem to be very effective at getting in rapidly. I think the challenge from my perspective is the why question. Why have they done this? There's three obvious headlines for me, one of which is warfare is all about seizing the initiative. It's all about momentum. For the whole of this summer, Russia's been on the front foot. Russia's been pushing Ukraine back, paying a huge price for that, but has been on the front foot. This is a way of demonstrating that Ukraine can actually be master of its own destiny. The second one, it's a demonstration that Russia isn't in control of everything. Up till now, Russia's been just pushing where it wants to. It's a very long border between Russia and Ukraine. And if Ukraine's done this once, it can show it and do it again. And the third one for me is just the impact on morale for beleaguered Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian people. I was speaking to a Ukrainian colleague just literally earlier at the weekend, and they were confidently saying that they wanted to see a Ukrainian flag placed in Moscow. And you sort of looked at them and went, now hang on a minute. But philosophically, it was a really proud moment that actually they were taking the fight to Putin. And I think even at this stage, Putin is still describing it as a sort of counter-terrorism operation rather than an act of war. And I think that just demonstrates how effective this attack, however small tactically, strategically, it's having a really profound impact on President Putin.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much giving Putin a taste of his own medicine. Ukraine knows what it feels like to have Russia invading its sovereign territory. Now the shoe is on the other foot. The other argument I've heard advanced, Sean, is that it's designed to draw troops away from the front line in Ukraine into Russia to help the situation on the front line in Ukraine?
Yeah, there's no doubt that is part of it. I think if you look at the huge numbers of troops that Russia has put into Ukraine, it cannot also maintain security of its border. But it wouldn't have expected Ukraine to mount its own counterattack. Why is that important? Because the number one priority of any political leader, Putin or whoever, is the protection of your own nation. And therefore, to have this Ukraine come in and actually do a mini invasion, that is very embarrassing for President Putin. He has to do something about it. And there's a lot of reports that Russia is moving troops away from the front line down in the Donbass and actually maneuvering them up into that Kursk Oblast to try to extinguish that threat. Now, I've no doubt that they will succeed. I think that will be a limited action. It doesn't look likely Ukraine will be able to hold the ground. But now you imagine you're Putin. You've seen this happen once. You look across the whole vast border. Where's it going to happen again? And of course, for Putin, who controls the media, he controls the messaging inside Russia. How on earth do you control the messaging when you've actually ended up vacating one region? We understand now that it's also Belgorod and Bryansk oblasts have also been evacuated. Imagine the message that sends to the people of Russia. It's all starting to unravel. And I think that's a really powerful message. And also, if it means that how does Russia square this circle of protecting its own border whilst also pushing hard on the front line? It inevitably is going to ease the pressure on the front line, which can only be to the benefit of Ukraine.
It's a really good point you make there. Until now, the war in Ukraine has felt quite far away for a lot of ordinary Russians. Now it is literally happening on the streets of Russia, and whether that changes public opinion remains to be seen. Are you surprised, Sean, that Russia hasn't been able to repel this incursion in the first 6 days?
Not really, to be honest. First of all, it's such a vast border. Secondly, all of its main troops are inevitably being wrapped up in the front line. There's reports that some conscripts were available on sort of duty around the area, certainly around the Kursk Oblast and around Sucha, but in relatively meagre numbers, plus a few locals. Now, conscripts have never been known for their professionalism. They know there's a war going on in another country, and they wouldn't have expected to see a breakthrough. I think what's really interesting is that President Zelensky hasn't actually talked that much about what's going on. There's clearly been a really high level of operational security, and it appears that the West was blindsided as well by this. Now, I'm not sure about that. I suspect that the Western media were blindsided, but these operations, if you're going to go into another country, anything on the offense, you're going to lose 3 times as many people as you do on defense. Hugely risky operation. So you're going to want to have a lot of intelligence to back up any attack you're going to make. That intelligence, some of it will come from Ukraine, but some of it will come from satellite technology. Some of it will come from Western assets that are the eyes and the ears over the battlefield. And I'd be quite surprised if Ukraine literally just did a stab in the dark. I suspect they did a lot of research, found out where the weakest part of the border lay and where the optimal chance was for a positive attack. And we still don't know the objectives. I mean, there is a report that there's a natural gas hub there that feeds the West. There's also a nuclear power station nearby. There's logistics support there. Who knows? But I suspect this is far more about symbolic and about relieving the pressure on the front line and causing President Putin to think, where next?
That's a really interesting point as to the West's role in this. Do you think some Western leaders will have tacitly endorsed this?
If you're President Zelensky, I'm going to ask the question the other way around. If you're President Zelensky, you know that the West has been prevaricating about giving them weapons that can be used on Russian territory. And therefore, the prospect of you actually going in and fighting in Russian territory, I wonder, you wouldn't necessarily ask a question you don't want to hear the answer to. And I suspect there'll be some Western leaders that President Zelensky would not want to ask that question. I do think that Zelensky's intimated that his commander Syrskyi of the command of the armed forces in Ukraine has basically looked at it and gone, we're on the back foot, we're fighting a bigger Russia, it's going to be the whole of this summer, how on earth do we relieve pressure? And you just imagine some madman in the back of the planning cell going, I've got an idea, let's invade Russia. And everybody would have looked at them and gone, well, don't be mad. Well, just give me a moment. And they've all of a sudden gone, do you know, this might just work, not to achieve the invading Russia and take ground, but just to set up doubt and just to relieve pressure. And therefore, I'm not entirely sure that this would have been an operation conducted with the close support of the West for political reasons. But I have no doubt that Western assets have been vital in providing intelligence to help make sure that it's an informed attack and that they minimise the casualties as they go.
I know you said earlier on, Sean, you're in little doubt that Russia will eventually drive the Ukrainian troops back out of Kursk. But how long do you think they can hold on?
Well, yeah, that's the $1,000 million question, isn't it? I think one of the objectives for Ukraine will be to do this for long enough that causes Putin as much embarrassment as possible. Let's face it, the quicker the Russians extinguish this threat, the more Putin can sell it as just a blip. The longer it goes on, the more he's got a war in his own territory. So I suspect Ukraine will want to keep it going for potentially up to a month if they can. But by the same contrast, if Putin only sends a few troops up to deal with it, they'll have a long bloody battle and it take a long time. If he sends up a lot of forces and actually degrades the frontline assets in the war, he probably can do this in a week or so. And also, it also depends on Ukraine. Is Ukraine expecting to lose people on this, or do they want to manage their resources really carefully and do a managed withdrawal out so that they minimize the casualties, maximize the political embarrassment for Putin, and then threaten elsewhere to do exactly the same thing? So my own view is that I think it'll be shorter rather than longer, because the longer it goes on, the more vulnerable the Ukrainians will be. But who knows?
The Russia analyst and former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, Michael Clark, wrote in the Times over the weekend saying this is President Zelensky's biggest gamble yet. Do you agree with that? And if so, at what point will we know whether his gamble has paid off?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge respecter of Michael. Michael and I work quite closely together at Sky. And of course, I think what's interesting is that Michael looks at it more from an academic perspective. I look at it more from an operational perspective as a seasoned warfighter. I'm not sure I would create the word gamble around this. It's a gamble if he was trying to take and hold ground and it was going to be incredibly bloody and lose a hell of a lot of kit and equipment. I think it's probably an inspired military strategy. Excuse me. Because it has caused President Putin to think. It has secured quite a lot of territory. It has relieved pressure on the front line. And I'm not sure that's a gamble. I think that's a really clever use of deception, of creating innovation on the front line. But the proof of the pudding, as we talked about earlier, will be how long it lasts for and what price Ukraine actually pays for this. That's the only part in it which I suspect I'm questioning. But I think it's an inspired move, genuinely inspired move, providing Ukraine doesn't pay a too high a price for it, because it tickles the underbelly of President Putin. It's forcing him to start to prioritize resources in the defense of Russia. He doesn't have that many, and if you take assets away from the front line, that will help ease the pressure on Ukraine.
Yeah, what kind of response do you think we'll see from the Russians inside Ukraine? Already in recent days, we've seen a deadly attack on a shopping centre in Konstantinivka. President Zelensky's accused Russia of being responsible for the fire at the giant nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. Do you think we will see more of that in the coming days?
Well, yeah, I think we've got to be careful joining the dots here. The Zaporizhia issue, at the moment, it always puts it on the front line. But Russian forces have occupied the biggest single nuclear site in Europe. They should not be doing that, and then firing out from that at Ukrainian soldiers invites fire back. But of course, then the Russians say, well, you're firing a nuclear reactor. It is worth bearing in mind, we get excited about the nuclear threat, but those reactors are designed to take a direct hit from a commercial airliner flying into them. They're not going to be damaged by a couple of hand grenades or some artillery fire. What is worrying is when you lose electricity, because obviously you lose the ability to cool them. My understanding is that there are about 20 standby generators. They need 4 working at any one time, and therefore, that shouldn't be an issue. I accept, though, that anything which requires you to rely on backup in a nuclear power station is probably not ideal. In terms of returning to the question, though, I mean, President Putin very famously is running out of missiles. He's importing them from North Korea, from Iran. He doesn't have huge supplies. So if he suddenly decides to just get petulant and throw a load of missiles at Ukraine, in a way, that is a good news for Ukraine. They'll have to deal with the near term, but it means that Russia is running even lower on missiles. I think the more worrying threat is this nuclear threat. Putin always suggested that if Russian territory came under threat, that's when it would trigger a nuclear war. But I think that's why it's fascinating seeing Putin's reaction to this. He described his special military operation into Ukraine as liberating towns and regions of Ukraine, and yet millions of people relocated, hundreds of thousands of people killed, communities devastated. Yet this Ukrainian advance into Russia, tiny by comparison, he's described it as a terrorist act and a provocation. It's quite clear that Putin does not want to talk to his people about going to war, doesn't want to put Russia on a war footing, does not want to start a nuclear confrontation. So in some respects, his main option here is to extinguish this Ukrainian advance as soon as humanly possible, and then make sure they can't do it again.
Let's talk about some more bad news for Vladimir Putin, and that's the arrival of the F-16s into Ukraine. As a former fighter pilot yourself, Sean, how big a difference will they make?
Well, I think they're not going to make as much difference as we all hoped. Bluntly, I think Ukraine has been promised up to 80. They needed about 160. But even if they got the 80, they haven't got the pilots to fly them. That's the long pole in the tent for them. So it looks likely they've probably got about a dozen at the moment. And you need a couple because inevitably they're not always going to be serviceable. Some of them are going to need servicing, etc. So you're not going to have very many on a daily basis available to fly. So the question is, how are they going to be used? And also, how do you hide them from Russia? Because President Putin famously put a bounty on the head of the F-16 and said, for the first Russian that shoots one down, I'm going to give 15 million rubles. That's about £150,000. So he's clearly rattled by it. I suspect that the big thing they'll do is cause the Russian pilots to just think twice. The F-16 is quite small. It's very capable. Russian pilots are used to fighting Ukrainian aircraft that are older, less capable than the Russians. All of a sudden, this F-16 arrives. It's small, agile. It's got a very good radar and now has Western weapons that can hurt the Russians. I suspect that'll just cause them to think. And I think that's particularly how are they going to be used? Probably not too close to Russian defenses. But of course, with these glide bombs that the Russians have been using, I suspect the F-16s will be used to try to limit the Russian Air Force's ability to continue delivering these glide bombs.
Just to bring you some breaking news we've had as we've been recording, Sean, President Putin has issued a statement about the incursion into Kursk. He's convened a meeting with officials on the situation in the border regions. He's told the meeting the Defence Ministry's main task is to push to kick the enemy out of our territory. He also says that Ukraine's motivation for the offensive was to improve its negotiating position. I appreciate you've just heard that, but what is your reaction to that, Sean?
Well, the first part of it, I think, as we said, it doesn't surprise me at all. He's basically saying we've got to kick them out. And I'm absolutely confident that he will move a lot of troops to make sure that he does that quickly. He won't want to do that over time. He'll want to use overwhelming force to force Ukraine out quickly and demonstrate that Putin's back in control. But you can't magic up these forces. They're going to have to be moved from somewhere, and therefore almost certainly from the front line. I think in terms of a negotiating strategy, over the last week, ever since this has happened, we've heard a whole series of different messages coming out from Russia, and most of them are contradictory. It's almost certain that Ukraine will not be able to hold this territory. I'd be amazed if that was their plan. And the only way to use it in a negotiating strategy would be to some way to hold it. And I think you're incredibly vulnerable for all sorts of reasons we could go into. So I don't think that's Ukraine's objective at all. It's useful for President Putin to frame it like that, because then when he kicks Ukraine out, he can say, look, they're not even strong enough to hold a little tiny bit of territory. So I think this is part of the game, the war of words and the information campaign around this. But it's entirely coherent with us saying that he's almost certainly going to want to use overwhelming force, kick Ukraine out quickly. The question is what happens then, because he will be vulnerable across the whole of the border.
Just to go back to the F-16 fighter jets, will they be able to effectively counter the Russian glide bombs?
The short answer is no. And I think part of that is just help for your viewers and listeners. The glide bomb sounds a really sexy state-of-the-art capability. In fact, all it is a World War II 1,000-pound, or in the Russians' case, a 1,500-pound bomb that you strap on a guidance kit. So you put on a sensor on the front of the bomb, a GPS normally, and a set of fins at the back end of it. It doesn't cost very much money. You can launch them from a fighter jet that's at 40,000 feet, and these things will therefore glide quite a long way. Now, they're not ideal if you want to bunker bust, because you need the bomb to hit the target very fast. Because if it's gliding, it's using up all of its kinetic energy just to, or potential energies just to fly a long way away. But of course, if you're using an airburst fuse, so bombs either go off when they hit the ground, when they go through the ground, or above the ground. If you're using an airburst fuse, so it's going to go above the ground, it doesn't really matter how fast the bomb is going. And what's very likely is that's what they're using them for on the front line. So you either target the bomb. There's a lot of bombs. I think over 200 a week are being used, over 3,000 in March alone. That would use up all of Ukraine's air defense missiles in very quickly. So it's probably not targeting the bomb. You could target the aircraft, but they're operating quite a long way behind the front line, or you target the supply chain. And over the last week, we've heard that Ukrainians have been targeting storage areas for these glide bombs, and I'm sure the F-16s will be using their radar just to light up the Russian aircraft so that the Russians go, "Ugh!" and give them a moment just to think before they launch the bomb. So I'm sure it will have an impact, but it won't be the answer to the maiden's prayer that perhaps some of the commentators are talking about.
And presumably some of the storage facilities are inside Russian territory, which would again give strength to the argument advanced by President Zelensky that Ukraine needs to be able to strike inside Russian territory more freely than it can currently.
Absolutely right, James. I mean, as a military guy, you can't have one hand tied behind your back with these things. Russia has invaded Ukraine. It can't operate behind that border with impunity and mass its forces, pile up weapons and stockpiles and know that they are safe. But I think gradually the West has, over our time talking over the last a couple of years, we were talking about air defense weapons or anti-tank weapons. Then we were talking about tanks, and there was lots of sucking of teeth, and eventually the Brits stepped forward. Then we were talking about long-range missiles like ATACMS and Storm Shadow. Then we were talking about F-16s. They've now arrived as well. I think we're gradually seeing more and more license given to Ukraine. I suspect that this foray into Russian territory will create a couple of political nightmares for the West just to how to play that out. But at the moment, I think it's an inspired move by President Zelensky.
And just finally, Sean, to return to what we started talking about, this incursion into the Kursk region by Ukraine, put it into context for us. How significant a development is it in the wider context of the war?
Well, it's huge, if only because, as we talked about at the start, this is the first time Russia's really been invaded since the Second World War. And therefore, symbolically, it's incredibly powerful. As a commentator around this, I was mortified when the US aid package of 60 billion was delayed. That gave President Putin the opportunity to recognize that Ukraine was short of weapons. Last year's spring offensive hadn't worked, and therefore Russia went, right, let's lick our lips, let's press on, let's try and achieve our objective with our special military operation. And it's been a really difficult summer for Ukraine. Russia's taken massive casualties, but it's a huge country. It doesn't care, but it's been gradually taking ground. I think what this incursion has done is it's taken, first of all, it's distracted Putin. He's going to have to divert forces away from the front line. That is massive. But also, it's really important that President Zelensky has been masterful at keeping the war on the front pages of the Western media organizations, keeping that support, which is vital for the Ukrainian success, and demonstrating that Ukraine is not down and out. Yes, it may have been on the back foot, but it's still there fighting, and it's still able to make a difference on the front line. That is a powerful message for President Zelensky to send with this incursion.
Sean, always appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Welcome. Lovely to chat to you, James.